We're live.
Okay. Welcome everybody to this afternoon's event, which UK and a Changing Europe is absolutely delighted to be working with Accessing Research Knowledge, ARC, the ARC initiative, which is a joint initiative between Queen's University Belfast and Ulster University. So tonight we're looking at political attitudes in Northern Ireland, and we're looking at the newly released Northern Ireland Life and Times survey. So I'm just going to let you know what we're going to do in the next hour and a half. First of all, Dr. Paula Devine, co-director of ARC and coordinator of the Northern Ireland Life and Times survey, is going to tell us a bit about the survey itself, how they ran it, things like that. So we're going to have an intro from Paula. Then the meat of the survey is going to be conveyed to us by the one and only Professor Katy Hayward, Professor of Political Sociology at Queen's University Belfast, and of course, Senior Fellow at UK in a Changing Europe. We're then going to have a bit of commentary on what it might mean, and we've got two very distinguished panelists who are going to do that. That is Professor Duncan Morrow from the Ulster University, Professor of Politics there, and Jamie Powell, who is a lecturer at Queen's University Belfast in politics. And then we're going to have a chat and get to your questions. You can post your questions on Slido. Can I suggest, I don't usually do this, but if you have deeply factual questions about what Katy says, post those while Katy's speaking. If there are things that we need to clarify, because God forbid, Katy's not been like super clear, she's going to show you a bunch of slides as well, then we can put those straight to Katy at the end of her session, clear those out of the way, and then we'll have the sort of more thoughtful, what does it all mean, sets of questions that you can post when Katy's finished and while you're listening to Duncan and Jamie. On Slido, there is an upvoting possibility. So please don't write an essay, because that's almost impossible to read and feed to our panelists. And if you see someone who has written the question that you sort of would have asked, inevitably not quite as well as you would have asked it, please upvote them rather than feel the need to slightly tweak your own version. And then we can make sure that we can rattle through a whole bunch of questions. So I'm sure there are going to be loads and loads of issues that you all want to be discussing. And hopefully we can look a bit longer term than just what sort of sausages will be on sale in Northern Ireland next month, because there are some bigger issues at stake, or at least I think there are. But that's partly because I don't like sausages anyway. Sacrilege. I'm going to move very, very quickly on to Dr. Paula Devine, and Dr. Devine is hopefully going to share some slides with us. So let's get going. Over to you, Paula.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the introduction, Jill, and also to the UK and Changing Europe for co-hosting this event with us today. It's been a busy day. We've been launching the findings of our latest survey, and it's great to have some really in-depth commentary on some of our questions on political attitudes. So thank you very much. I would just want to give a short introduction to the survey, what it is and how we did it. Okay. ARC is a joint initiative, as Jill said, across Queen's University Belfast and Ulster University, which was established in 2000, with the aim of making social and political information in Northern Ireland widely accessible to anybody who wants access to it. So that's anything from academics to students at school, to policymakers, to NGOs, media, anyone across the world. Some of our key resources include our suite of 3 public attitude surveys. The Life and Times is just one of 3 surveys that we run. We have NILT, the Life and Times survey, which is of 18-year-olds, 18 plus, and that started in 1998. So we've been running now for nearly 23 years. But we also have the Young Life and Times survey, which is an online survey of 16-year-olds, which began in 2003, and the Kids Life and Times survey, which is an online survey of 10 and 11-year-olds in primary 7, which started in 2008. So in that way, we can record public attitudes and opinions and views of people of all ages across Northern Ireland. And where possible, we will try to ask questions where appropriate across the 3 surveys. So Life and Times itself, as I said, annual survey began in 1998 with the aim of monitoring the attitudes and behaviour of people in Northern Ireland. And Life and Times itself is based upon the Northern Ireland Social Attitude Survey, which ran between 1989 and 1996, which was very much linked to British Social Attitude Survey at the time as well. The focus is on key social policy issues affecting our lives, and time series is really important in that. The topics that we cover every year reflect the key social and policy debates that are happening at the time. Some of those change over time in terms of the topics. Some attitudes change over time, or sometimes in Northern Ireland and in other places, attitudes don't change over time. So time series is really important. Some of our questions, in fact, have been asked since the Social Attitude Survey in 1989. So we have a long range of data. And people in particular are interested in the constitutional preferences, the perception of relations between the different communities living here, and identity. And those are, I suppose, the three main issues for which people like to see how things are changing over time. So this graph is just shows the perception of relations between Catholic and Protestant communities in Northern Ireland between 1998 and 2020. So it's saying, we asked respondents what they think, how they think relations between Protestant and Catholic communities in the previous 5 years, and we also asked what they think they would be like in 5 years' time. And you can see that obviously there's very much a link between political and social events and attitudes. So you can see a dip in perceptions of relations during the Holy Cross dispute in the early 2000s, some optimism when devolution was restored in 2007. The flag protests of 2012-13 was another dip. Things have gone up and down and actually got quite low over the last few years with the suspension of the Assembly. But in the most recent data in 2020, we can see that perhaps things are changing with time. So Life and Times is very much about looking at perhaps the long-term climate. It's not about looking out the window and seeing what the weather is today. One really good benefit of it is that we do have the time series, and we're also really important to look to see what the other context is at the time. In general, between 1998 and 2019, the survey was undertaken as a face-to-face interview, and it was followed by a short self-completion section. It's a random sample of households within Northern Ireland from which we randomly select one adult. There isn't a good this individual survey, there isn't an individual sampling frame, a sampling frame of individuals in Northern Ireland. So we have to take a sample of households and from that randomly select one person. So say it was face-to-face interview with short self-completion for the first 21 years of the survey, which was very much same as the Northern Ireland Social Attitude Survey that went before it. Of course, in 2020, then all of that had to change because of the pandemic. So we had to rethink how we were going to run the survey. The survey is funded by a wide range of funders. It's important that the survey isn't funded by just one organisation. And so by having a range of funders, we can provide an independent source of evidence. And we were also very lucky that in 2020, the funders felt that it was important to record the views of people during living through the pandemic, even though we had to change the way that we did the survey. So we ran an online questionnaire and 95% of respondents completed the survey that way. We also gave them the option for a video interview and also then an offline option for those who didn't want to or couldn't or didn't have access to broadband, and that was on a phone interview. That was actually quite a feat. The online questionnaire took about 55 minutes. The phone interview, I'd say, probably took 1.5 hours just because of the different having to read out the questions and the show cards. So we'd just like to say well done to those few respondents who undertook the survey by phone. So 1,292 respondents, sorry, I had 16 plus, it's actually 18 plus, took part in the survey. The field work was start of October to start of December 2020 with the field work undertaken by Ipsos Morrow. And of course, whenever you change survey mode or anything else to do with the survey, such as the survey time, then you may find some differences in either your sample or the respondents. The fieldwork time was similar to in previous years. The Life and Time survey is always undertaken in the autumn, so that we were in the field at the same time as previous years. But as I say, the survey mode was different. Respondents were also offered a £15 thank you voucher for taking part. We found some sample differences compared to previous years. So we had a higher proportion of respondents saying that they had a higher income than in previous years. We also found there's a higher proportion of people who said that they had voted Alliance or were Alliance voters, and fewer respondents who said that they were voters or supporters of Sinn Féin. There are several reasons for that, some of which are not related to the survey mode. Obviously, we have to bear in mind that not everybody's interested in politics, not everybody votes, not everybody is a supporter of the range of political parties that are available in Northern Ireland. But those are just some of the things that we want to highlight in terms of the actual survey and the sample. So Life and Times tries to reflect the different debates that are going on. So in the survey in 2020, we had questions on good relations, which is about the different relations between the different communities in Northern Ireland, attitudes to minority ethnic groups and other groups living in Northern Ireland, respect, politics and Brexit, which are the questions that Katy is going to highlight now, community safety, perception of paramilitary influence, criminal justice system, coercive control, and of course, COVID. So on our website today, 2019 and 2020, all other years, we have got the questionnaires, the technical reports, tables of results broken down by age, sex and religious grouping, the data to download in SPSS and Stata, so anybody can undertake their own analysis, although obviously we have had to group and aggregate some responses in order to ensure anonymity of the respondents and the research updates, and all of those are available on the website now at NILT/2020. So thank you. Hopefully that will give you some introduction as to how we actually ran the survey. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. And as Paula said, this is genuinely breaking news today, because today is the first time we've actually had all these results released. So Paula's told us about the survey methodology. Katy's going to interpret the results for us. So I'm delighted to hand over to Professor Katy Hayward. Katy.
Thank you very much, Jill, and hello everybody. And it's a particular delight to be working with UK and Changing Europe and ARC, and to be welcoming our members of the audience who wouldn't normally necessarily be considering the findings of the Northern Ireland Life and Time survey. So welcome to our usual supporters in NI and also to the new ones. So I'm just going to share my slides. So I trust you can see that okay. So so what we're concentrating on in this short presentation is those questions that we have in relation to political attitudes. And we're framing this as political attitudes in a period of transition because, of course, there's a little play on words there. We were in the transition period at the time that this survey was conducted. And I think the context of that flux is possibly reflected to some degree in the results of this survey. I just want to begin by thanking Ben Rutter for his fantastic work with me on the survey data, and he's a pleasure to work with, but any mistakes I take full responsibility for. So what I'm going to try and cover in the 20 minutes I have, I'll keep an eye on the time, is three big topics, and they are pretty broad. The Constitution, as I'm putting it, so attitudes in relation to the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, the impact that Brexit has been perceived to have, and then identities. And I don't go into much detail on that last topic, but you can see why I've picked those three meaty ones to present to you this evening. There are many other questions, as Paula has already mentioned, and I would encourage you to go and have a look at the NILT website to take a look at some of the details there. Paula's already given you a summary of the survey itself. Just to sort of note, I think we've been obviously carefully considering what the impact might have been of using this different mode in collecting this data. And I think a sort of a superficial reading of it, or an initial reading of it, is that there has been notably a decline in the don't know responses. And I think I'm going to mention where I think this might be significant, but that's possibly been the most evident impact that moving to online questionnaires has had. I will underline that point that Paula made at the beginning about when we looked at how people voted in the December 19 general election, as we asked them. We see that Alliance Party supporters happen to be overrepresented in our sample and Sinn Féin supporters underrepresented. So just as that little health warning when we're looking at constitutionally significant questions around constitutional status, just bear that in mind. The same too with identities. And then the context. So not only were we in the transition period, we were also at a point in October to December last year in which there were continued tensions over the protocol. It's very familiar, isn't it? But the UK and the EU quite at odds around the protocol, and that was having an impact on the future UK-EU deal, whether there would be one or not, and the nature of that deal. The two things are very much intertwined. It's also worth remembering, for the context of this survey, that in contrast to 2019, we at this point had Stormont up and running again, thanks to the New Decade, New Approach document that was signed off in January last year. So that makes some difference as well when we're considering people's views and attitudes around politics locally and their views about the future. So constitution-related questions. So first and foremost, we've been asking this for a while about views on the Belfast Good Friday Agreement as the basis for governing Northern Ireland. And now we're comparing here, and we do this a lot in some of these presentations of these questions. We compare 2019 results with 2020 results, because as Paula says, this is one of the real values of the time series that NILT provides. So although we see overwhelmingly people think that the Belfast Good Friday Agreement remains the best basis for governing Northern Ireland, what we have seen over the course of 2020 compared to 2019 is that there is an increase in those who think that it needs to be reformed. And again, mentioning the significance of the New Decade, New Approach document in January, at the beginning of 2020, which did note some areas for improvement in the functioning of the Assembly, for example. This is a little bit more than this, recognising or considering that most people are saying, yes, the Good Friday Agreement is the best basis, but we do need to reform it now in light of the current situation. We see that also there is a slight increase in those, say from 10% to 15%, who are opposed to the Good Friday Agreement or think that it's not a good basis for governing Northern Ireland. And to some degree, perhaps this is related to the decline in the don't knows. So an interesting question often arises in relation to views around the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, and that is around religious identity, as it's often put. So Catholic respondents are generally more positive in relation to the Good Friday Agreement. That's always been a trend since 1998. And we see here, I've contrasted their 2019 and 2020 results between Protestant and Catholics and those of no religion. And we see quite some differences there between Protestant and Catholic respondents, with some, it's a significant growth amongst Protestant respondents in 2020 of those who think that the Good Friday Belfast Agreement is no longer a good basis for governing NI, and that it's, or indeed that it's never been a good basis for doing so. I think that's a particularly significant finding. And also there, if we're looking at the Catholic respondents, you can see there the significant growth in those who think that the Good Friday Agreement needs reform. The same too, of course, of those of no religion. And then this chart reflects the results in our big constitutional status of Northern Ireland question. We ask, what should the long-term policy for Northern Ireland be? And as you can see, we've asked this every year. The survey has been running since '98. And there was the moment in 2007 where we dropped the question around whether we clarified the question to include the distinction between UK with devolution or UK with direct rule. So that's what that orange line is there. And we have seen an increase from 2019 to 2020 in those who are saying that they think the long-term policy for Northern Ireland should be to reunify with the rest of Ireland, and a drop in those who are saying Northern Ireland should remain part of the UK, although that is still the clear majority. There's slightly different answers in the question, if there were a bolder poll tomorrow, how would you vote? You can see here consistently there's been the clear majority saying they don't think they wouldn't be voting for Irish unification, so that result slightly increased. Not significantly really last year for those who are opposed to Irish unity, but a notable increase in those who are saying that that Northern Ireland should unify with the Republic of Ireland, so almost 5% there. And similarly, there was a drop in that number of don't knows by around the same margin. So potentially, possibly, that's what's affecting that result there. And then we were asking, one thing we were conscious of in drawing up these modules is that we tend to focus on Irish unity in asking about constitutional status, and we've done less in relation to the UK. And of course, the question of the future of the UK is becoming increasingly a matter of debate within various parts of the UK. And so we've asked this question for the first time now about, do you think the United Kingdom will still exist in 20 years? Alongside the more familiar question that we've been asking, which is, will there be a United Ireland in 20 years? And from this, we see that actually it's not, that more people think the UK will exist in 20 years' time, but it's not, there's not a huge difference there. And the percentages there are around 41% of those who are thinking it's likely or quite likely that it will. I mean, those who are saying it's very likely is actually a relatively small proportion of our respondents. And that's sort of indicates, I think, the significance of the current events, that many people are thinking again about the surety of that wider constitutional question, whether you're looking with respect to United Ireland or the continuation of the United Kingdom. We also asked new questions on the value of being in the UK. And I will tell you what the question that we asked here. Regardless of your preference as to the constitutional status of Northern Ireland, what do you value about Northern Ireland's current constitutional status? And we asked the questions that you'd probably expect us to ask, I hope anyway, around the NHS. About being in the UK economy, particularly including subvention, having devolved powers for Northern Ireland, being part of the UK in and of itself, whether that's what people value, the post-primary education system in Northern Ireland, which is quite distinct in the UK, and it's certainly different to the one in the South, full access to BBC services, and then not being in the EU, which of course Northern Ireland is no longer in the EU as a result of being part of the UK. And we see here a really striking result when it comes to what people value. And it's great to have figures now on this rather than just anecdotes. So essentially, we see 97% of people saying that they value the NHS. And bearing in mind what a year it was last year with COVID, that's really that's probably a significant factor as well. Also being in the UK, including the subvention, but again, very strong support for that dimension of, very strong amount of valuing of that part of what it is to be in Northern Ireland today. The thing that is, again, at the very opposite end of the spectrum about not being in the EU, the majority of people clearly don't value that. And again, that's probably not surprising, but it was great because we basically wanted to do similar questions to the ones we did last year around Irish unity and look at what people value about being in the UK. And there's lots more in that we can analyse and we'll be presenting over the course of the year. Brexit. I thought we'd better talk about that in relation to UK and a changing Europe, not least. So we've asked since 2017 about people's views on whether Brexit makes a united Ireland more likely, and then whether it changes their views on Irish unification. And we saw a huge growth last year from 2019 to 2020 in those who are saying that it makes united Ireland more likely. So that figure has grown by 19 points over the course of 2019 to 2020. I mean, it's an extraordinary leap in those who are thinking that Irish unity is made more likely by Brexit. Impact on a preference for United Ireland, this has grown by 10 points from 2019. So that too is significant. We're not seeing it necessarily in those questions I mentioned before around how would you vote. But generally we are seeing that there's a decline in those who are saying it's made no difference and an increase in those who are saying they're more in favour of that happening. So this is a really significant result, I think. And you'd expect us to dig into it, wouldn't you? And we did. And I looked at it in terms of party. And this is a really fascinating result, I think. So rather than just going unionist nationalist, if you look at parties, then you can see there's a little bit more, you can see there's even differences there. So interestingly, Sinn Féin, a slight decline there in those who are saying it makes United Ireland more likely. Increase in SDLP, bearing in mind the SDLP supporters from 2018 to 2019, they significantly leapt in their views and thinking that it made Irish unity more likely. Alliance Party also grew from 2018, I think it was around 30-something% who were saying that it made United Ireland more likely. That leapt in 2019 to 53%. And if you look at that figure now, we see 78% of Alliance Party supporters saying that Brexit makes Irish unification more likely. We also see a huge leap, 22 points amongst the Ulster Unionist Party supporters, who are moving from saying it makes no difference to saying it makes United Ireland more likely. And even then, among strong unionists, the DUP, a huge leap there. In those who are saying 14 points in those who are saying that it makes the United Ireland more likely. So if you think about this context, 2019 to 2020, that transition period, all of that uncertainty and flux, we have the Northern Ireland Executive and Assembly functioning or trying to in a particular time of health crisis, and all of those UK negotiations, all of the pressure in relation to the protocol, and individual party supporters thinking about what all this might mean, and particularly those thinking of the UUP and DUP about what it means with respect to what they don't want to see. Perhaps this helps us understand why we're seeing the reaction we are in Northern Ireland's current affairs in response to the protocol. Also, just to have a look at views on Irish unity amongst Remainers and Leavers, and looking at whether Brexit makes people more in favour of Irish unification or not. This is a question that often comes up, that people often ask. And we can see it has made a difference. If you look at basically Remain as a clear majority now, saying that it makes them more in favour of Irish unity. And then look though on Leavers, Brexit makes them less in favour, so more opposed to Irish unification than they would have been otherwise. So again, you see that polarising response to Brexit and how that could be, how that could lead to an entrenchment of differences around those big constitutional questions. The protocols. So interestingly, we asked people, have you about their knowledge of the protocol, and 47% said they had some knowledge of it, and 50% or so saying they didn't. That doesn't stop people having opinions about it, of course. And so we asked, do you think the protocol is on balance a good thing for Northern Ireland? is it a mixed bag, which is possibly not a terribly scientific phrase, but it was the best we could come up with. Is the protocol on balance a bad thing? And then this question, which is asking genuinely, it's sort of giving people reflecting what they might genuinely say if they were asked face to face informally. I don't know enough about it to have a strong opinion. So we see here 46% saying it's a mixed bag, and then you can see there's more or less equal, a slightly greater number saying that it's a bad thing for Northern Ireland, but more or less equal between it being a good thing and being a bad thing. So those who have clear opinions, and then those who are saying 1 in 5 saying that they don't know enough to have a strong opinion. You move over to the Remainers and Leavers. We differentiated between them in these answers. Interestingly enough, 45% of both were saying it's a mixed bag. Remainers, 22% saying they think it's good, around the same figure, saying that they didn't know enough to have a strong opinion. However, Leavers, we see here, they did have a strong opinion, so over a third, well over a third, thinking that it's a bad thing for Northern Ireland on balance. Bearing in mind this was before the protocol really, obviously, before it came into force and before we actually knew it was spelled out exactly what it would mean in light of the nature of the Brexit that the UK had negotiated with the EU. Okay, and then I'm not long to go now. So just a couple of questions in relation to identities, and really interesting data here as well. I've just looked at 2 elements here. So one is in relation to national identities. And we can see that if you're looking at it on balance, you see that around 49% are a mixture of British and Irish. And I think that's worth bearing in mind. This is different from obviously holding passports or holding citizenship, like formal citizenship. But do people consider their national identity to be a mix of British and Irish? And yes, 49%, almost 1 in 2 are saying yes, they do. Notably, those who are saying they're equally British and Irish, that figure rose by 5% between 2019 and 2020. And those who are saying that they're exclusively British, that figure declined in the same year. Also worth remembering, of course, those who are other identities, not British or Irish, and there's a substantial portion of the population. I should say in relation to this to remember that Sinn Féin is underrepresented in this sample, and I will remind us of that too in relation to this pie chart. And what we saw, basically, we're comparing these. If you compare these results from 2019, there was a slight increase in those who are saying they're unionist, decrease in those who are saying they're nationalist, and an increase in those who are saying that they are neither. It seems that increase, the don't knows are actually the same as they were in 2019. There's a decline in those who are saying they were other. But that neither figure is up more towards the way it was a couple of years ago. It declined last year, but it's up. But I think the most important finding is one that's we've consistently had for a number of years now, and that is that the neither groups for almost 15 years, the neithers are the largest portion of our respondents. And I think even if you accounted for Alliance being overrepresented and Sinn Féin being underrepresented, I think we'd probably see a similar pattern in the pie chart, with neither still being the largest and being more nationalist, of course. So to conclude, it's quite difficult to summarize all of that. In the research update that Ben and I have written, summarizing the political attitudes modules, we basically conclude that in some ways political attitudes remain more predictable than the politics. And goodness knows what environment the Northern Ireland Life and Time Survey will be conducted in at the end of this year. But essentially, there's some relevant points of continuity. So most people thinking very clearly, over 2/3, that the Good Friday Belfast Agreement is the best basis for governing Northern Ireland, although there is this growing sense that it needs reform. A majority are in favour of the UK Northern Ireland remaining in the UK. Again, this is a consistent finding in the in NILT, even accounting for underrepresentation of Sinn Féin, that figure around 50% remains pretty firm. Although we should recognise now we know a little bit more as to why people think that, and the NHS and the economy is really important there. Largest portion of the respondents saying they're neither unionist nor nationalist, and almost 1 in 2 being both British and Irish to some degree. However, in the transition period, there was a continued flux and a growing sense of a changing context. So minority thinking that the UK and United Ireland or United Ireland will exist in 20 years. And basically Brexit is obviously very much a critical factor, adding to the uncertainty around those huge issues as well as the more local ones. And essentially those views that we saw there around the impact of Brexit and around the protocol itself before Brexit proper came into force and before the protocol came into force helps us understand why Northern Ireland politically is where it is right now, with a particular focus on the protocol and what it might mean. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Katy. I'm just I did say if we had any factual questions that I might just put them to you before Jamie and Duncan come in and tell us what this means. And we've got lots and lots of questions coming in. We've got a question from Jeff Horn, just asking about age differences in response to the constitutional questions. Is there an age gap that cuts across community-based views? Can you tell that from the survey, Katy?
Well, can I suggest if you tell me what these questions are, Paula and I will go and have a look at the answer.
All right, okay, so there's a question on that. Well, another question which you will be able to answer, I think, is why is the NHS such a big factor? This is Calder Kasler, who's asking, is there not a health service in the Republic? Why is this such a killer win card for the union?
There is a public health service. I mean, it's not free at the point of delivery for most people, although there is some. So for most people, they have to buy insurance or else you pay. But I think, so bear in mind what this question was, and that was, what do you value about being in the UK? And most clearly, the vast majority value the NHS in that regard. So it's not necessarily an implied criticism of the thing in the public health service in the South, but it is about what people might value about being part of the UK. And the NHS is very unique, of course, in that regard.
Okay, and a final quick question from me, Katy. When people say Good Friday Agreement remains a good basis but needs reform, do you ask them in the survey what that reform looks like? Do we have any idea what they want reforming about the Good Friday Agreement arrangements? Or is that just, it's okay, but it needs a bit of an updating and it's just a catch-all for anything?
We haven't asked detailed questions on that for some time. And this is the nature of the surveys like this. We don't know what they have in mind when they say it needs reform. We could speculate, and I'm sure Jamie and Duncan could join with me in that, but we don't specifically know. We could ask them next year. It might be the way to go, to see whether there is consensus about what really needs to be reformed. So if I start to comment further, it will just be speculation.
Okay, brilliant. Katy, I'm going to let you go away and try and cobble together an answer to Jeff's question about age differences. And we're going to go over to Duncan and then Jamie. And I should warn both Duncan and Jamie that the top voted question from Kevin Webb is, do you see unification of Ireland within the next 20 years? So you might want to touch on that in your comments. If not, I'll come back to that and I'll give Katy a chance to answer that as well. But now, Professor Duncan Morrow. Duncan, take us away.
Well, the answer to the top question is, as Tom Devine said, the future is not my period. The first of all, thank you very much for inviting me and the opportunity to talk at the seminar today, and also thanks to Paula and to Katy for all of their work. And as ever with all of these things, there's much to ponder and more questions that arise out of it, but they are important indicators. And I think there are obvious things in here, roughly speaking, of those who expressed an opinion taking out all the don't knows. It's still at about 62% saying they don't want a united Ireland at this point, against 38% as I measure it. And I think that's something which the Life and Time survey has pretty much continuously told us, and is an issue, of course, that we have to set against other opinion polls with different questions. But nevertheless, it does say that for all the uncertainty, and there's huge amounts of uncertainty which are reflected in this, there's no rush to a simple constitutional solution. So that's the first thing I would say, is anybody who thinks there's a simple light on, light off type of answer to this is not given much support in this survey for me. Second of all, I think the persistence of the neithers, possibly even over time the rise of the neithers, is important, even as we see a contradictory thing going on here, which is polarization around a number of key questions. So how you make sense of the two of those is complicated, of course, without further questions. But I think what it does say is that the question we asked before about a united Ireland will probably be decided there. And it is in that group. And that is whether polarization is a good way to persuade neithers is a political tactical question, but it is certainly adds to the mix that if anybody's persuadable, one would have to assume that they're in that group and that they now constitute 45% of the population. There are so many things though underlying this which strike me, and I'm not going to speak for more than my allotted 10 minutes. So first of all, I think some of the issues do suggest that there is, if not a crisis, at least a question of confidence in governance going on in Northern Ireland. One of the things that's really interesting is the shift from people who think the Good Friday Agreement as it is should continue, and those who think it needs reform. Now, you asked, of course, what does reform mean? And that's a very open-ended question. But for me, at the first level of analysis, it says people like it in principle, but they're not so sure about it in practice. And so that it requires some adjustments. And that suggests a degree of uncertainty. I think also the further analysis of Protestant support, 60% of people think the Good Friday, of Protestants think that it's a good, it should continue as is or with reform. That still leaves a considerable minority who now feel not so confident in that, compared to 80% on the Catholic side. So the Good Friday Agreement itself has always had that imbalance within it somewhere, but it is significant in the course of where we are now. But support for direct rule in the last 2 years has fallen from 20% to 15%. So as an alternative, it's not clear what that is. Support for United Ireland is up from 19% to 26% in the last 2 years as well, which is a considerable jump. And support for devolution has fallen from 2015, when it was 54%, to 40%, which is the lowest proportion supporting devolution on the graphs since 1998. So it does suggest, and that may not be surprising. We've had 3 years of no government and 1 year of COVID government. So that may be an element of that. But it does suggest that while the Good Friday Agreement has questions around it, exactly what people want is not clear, and a degree of uncertainty about governance. A second point that might be worth making is the huge change in expectations, and therefore the psychological fear of crime rather than crime itself, around whether what Brexit has made United Ireland more likely. So the likelihood question now shows that 58% think it is more likely. I think that is a really staggering figure, actually, particularly when you see that the jump, as Katy pointed out, is within unionism and within the Alliance voting group. In other words, that it is those who supported Brexit and the unionist groups who now feel they've made it more likely. And those in the Alliance Party, it's now almost 80% of people in the Alliance Party believe, and they're, I suppose, in the persuadable group, believe that it's made it more likely, and 2% think it's made it less likely. So if the goal was to persuade the centre with Brexit, it doesn't look as if it's going very well. The protocol, there are a number of issues, I suppose, which I think may even be changing now, and why these attitude surveys are really important that we repeat them and repeat them and repeat them, because they in many ways reflect what are the political issues of their time, and then they're translated into these questions. But the fact that 45% of the population thought it was a mixed bag and only 35% of leavers thought that the protocol was a bad thing, I imagine that has got harder and tighter and more extreme as we've gone further. So I think that we can only speak about the figures we have, but we have to say that the way politics has developed, these figures were before the protocol was anything other than a theoretical construct, have certainly been much more in the news. And I think that the issue of that's really clear is this, that Katy also brought out, of uncertainty about whether a United Ireland or a United Kingdom will continue, and the sheer range of views, so no consensus on either of those issues, is also affected by so many factors externally. So to conclude with an interesting one on Britishness, you asked a question about, or somebody asked a question about the National Health Service, and it does suggest that the NHS has become the symbol of British safety, welfareism, and so on. But it also suggests that the current crisis in Northern Ireland of waiting lists may be the biggest threat to the Union. And also that if I was working for United Ireland, I would create a better public health service in Ireland. But that people will be won over in that persuadable group less by the flag than by issues around the subordinate issues in the economy, in the issues around the NHS, and in the issues around the persist or better governance and so on. So those are certainly interesting questions suggested by this. None of them are definitive. We have to look further, but I think that it's worthwhile discussing whether what light it throws on what's actually happening underneath in an extremely uncertain situation.
It is fascinating looking at the moment at all these results, which were, while still things like the protocol were theory rather than practice, to think about actually what would those results look like now. And inevitably, we don't have anything as robust as this data. Going to come over to Jamie. And Jamie, you might want to pick up a question that Dr. Simon Sweeney has asked, and I think it's one that probably occurs to people over here quite a lot, which is, we've got this big neither community that now self-identifies. And to those of us this side of the Irish Sea, we sort of assume neithers will be natural alliance voters. And Simon Sweeney's asked, why doesn't the Alliance Party do better in elections when so many respond that they are neither unionist or nationalist? And maybe you'd like to knock that one off as you comment. And then if Katy or Duncan want to come in on that later, they can. Anyway, Jamie, Pat.
Thanks very much indeed, Jill. So I'll certainly try and cover Simon's question as we go. And I've prepared some remarks here. So I was smiling as Duncan was speaking there, and as Katy was speaking as well, because there might be some overlap. But let's see what we make of that. So thanks again to ARC and the UK and Changing Europe for organising the event and for having me along today. And thank you to Katy and Ben Rosher for sharing your briefing in advance. So for me, three immediate takeaways from what I've seen are first regarding the constitutional question, secondly regarding the appetite for some kind of institutional reform, and finally on the extent of polarization. So first of all, on the constitutional question, there is something for everyone really in these results. because advocates of both constitutional change and maintaining the status quo will find some encouragement here from different statistics, but neither side has much room for complacency. And this general takeaway is very much in line from what we've seen in other recent polls and academic surveys lately. So from the perspective of those on the pro-union side of the argument, there are grounds for encouragement in the sense that a majority of people say that they would vote against a united Ireland if a referendum were held tomorrow on the issue, compared to only 30% who say they would vote for a united Ireland. So again, fairly consistent with other recent findings that put pro-union support on just over 50%. But the fact that it is just over 50%, and that there remains a large proportion of people who are undecided on the issue, means that support for staying in the UK isn't exactly overwhelming. And then from the perspective of those advocating a united Ireland, even though the level of support for a united Ireland in terms of reported voting intentions falls far short of a majority, they will be encouraged by some signs of things moving in that direction. And Brexit has clearly served to galvanise this attitudinal movement. But even though a clear majority of people think that Brexit makes a united Ireland more likely, it's still, of course, as has been said, only a minority who think that a united Ireland is likely to come about within the next 20 years or so. So thinking something is more likely isn't the same as thinking something is likely. But mind you, it's also, of course, the case that only a minority think that it's likely that the UK will continue to exist in 20 years' time. So uncertainty in different respects and something for everyone. But the results don't provide any evidence that the arguments of either side will be put to voters in a referendum, at least in the immediate future. As we know, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland can call a referendum on the constitutional issue at any time, but he or she is only obliged to do so if it appears likely that a majority would support joining a united Ireland. And that threshold isn't met here from what we see in front of us. But it is easy to imagine that a referendum will be called at some point, at least in the medium term. And the latest results confirm what we would expect to be two of the main issues in the debate, namely the NHS and the economic benefits of being in the UK. Both of these are valued by a large majority of people. The pro-union side will likely make them front and centre of its campaign. But even though a large number of people valued these things at the time of the survey, people will likely evaluate them more closely and more critically ahead of the referendum. So going along with what Duncan was saying there, for example, not just valuing the NHS as important to them in itself, but reflecting on its actual performance. Over 300,000 people in Northern Ireland are on a waiting list for a first appointment. And it had the worst waiting list statistics in the UK well before the pandemic. So day-to-day policy outcomes and the perceived effectiveness of public services, not just the existence of public services, will likely play an important role in shaping the referendum campaign if and when it comes. My second takeaway relates to the level of support for some kind of institutional change besides constitutional change. So it's striking that compared to 2019, basically the same proportion of people support the Belfast Good Friday Agreement as the best basis for governing Northern Ireland in 2020. And most of those who don't say they support it are in the don't know category. So only a small minority oppose the agreement outright, but of course, you know, that small minority is concerning. But among the roughly 70% who are explicitly supportive, 2/3 say that the arrangements are in need of reform, which is a significant jump, as we've discussed. And it's particularly striking that the appetite for reform isn't confined to people from one particular community. Support for reform is fairly evenly distributed across Catholics, Protestants, and others. And in terms of age, at the highest level of support for reform comes from the youngest age group, the 18 to 24-year-olds. So, as has been alluded to already, this does raise further questions. So firstly, what are the kinds of reforms that people have in mind? An obvious one is likely to do with the nature of power sharing at Stormont, perhaps to try and make it work more effectively in the eyes of the wider public. Should it continue on the current maximalist model of power sharing, whereby any party meeting a relatively low threshold of seats is automatically entitled to serve in the executive? Or has the time come to move towards a looser model of power sharing, some form of qualified voluntary coalition? The future of things like the petition of concern could be another issue on the table. The nature of the offices of Deputy First Minister and First Minister could be on the table. Should the office of First Minister be nominated by the largest party in the largest community? Should the offices be renamed to joint First Ministers? Lots of possible procedural topics that might be on the table. And none of these are likely, of course, to be addressed before the next Assembly election, which is due within the next 11 months, but they may come to the fore in the aftermath of that election. So the second important question arising is, how might potential reforms be considered? A key criticism of previous institutional reforms has been the rather top-down, behind the closed doors nature of cross-party negotiations. So a more participatory, more deliberative approach might help to enhance the legitimacy of any reforms, and possibly even try to help buy in support from those who are the most skeptical of the existing arrangements that we see from those who are opposed to the arrangement outright. So citizens' assemblies or similar kinds of initiatives could play a constructive role alongside input from the political parties. And finally, my last takeaway from the latest results is that while, of course, Northern Ireland remains a place with deep divisions, the extent of polarization among the public as a whole shouldn't be overstated. There is more complexity and more nuance than might be expected, which isn't unique to just these 2020 survey results, but it's an observation that can still be overlooked sometimes when we're discussing Northern Ireland politics. In terms of national identity, just over 40% of people identify as exclusively British or Irish, but as we've seen, about half of all respondents identified as both to some extent, with a further 7% holding another national identity altogether. Then in terms of ethno-national ideology, just over half of all respondents identify as either unionist or nationalist, but that plurality of 42% identify as neither nationalist nor unionist. So in response to Simon's question, many of these people will still hold a view on the constitutional question, but it doesn't define their identity. So we can imagine people in this group to be the most likely to be open to persuasion on their long-term constitutional preference rather than treating it as being fixed. And we also do know from previous studies that this group can be more likely not to vote at all, because elections can still be quite dominated by the ethno-national question, even though there are parties like the Alliance Party that are in the other category. And finally, every year, the Life and Time survey asks respondents about their perceptions of community relations and how they appear to be going, which Paula showed a graph of this trend at the beginning of the event. So will relations between Protestants and Catholics be better or worse in 5 years' time? And since 1998, the overall picture had been up and down at different points. But we did see in the most recent few years, in the surveys conducted after the 2016 referendum, there did seem to be a trend towards generally less optimism and more pessimism. But the 2020 results, from what we've seen here, do seem to break this trend. So half of people say that relations between the two main communities will be about the same in 5 years' time. 35% say they will be better, and just 7% think that they will be worse. The caveat, as we know, is that the survey was conducted at the end of last year, so more recent events may have shaken people's overall levels of optimism. But I do think that it's still worth highlighting both the level of nuance in people's identities across Northern Ireland, and that perceptions of community relations might not be as negative as might be expected. But we'll obviously have to keep an eye on these as they respond to events. So those are my initial takeaways. And of course, I'm very happy to discuss further and to answer any questions. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Jamie and Duncan. Katy, Did you have any thoughts on Duncan and Jamie's comments? I'm particularly intrigued actually by what this reform agenda might look like, and whether there's actually a sort of common reform agenda for the Good Friday Agreement and its institutions, or whether that would be another source of tension and polarization. And I'm not sure whether you and Paula have worked out the answer yet to Jeff's question, because if you have, but Katy, over to you, and then I think Duncan will come in. Katy.
Yes, well, so with thanks to Paula and to Ben, we're a great team. I'm able to answer Jeff's question with copious amounts of statistics. But just to give you the headline results, which is actually, I would say we always get a little bit cautious when we break it down into age groups, because then you begin to just talk about smaller numbers. But nonetheless, there are some interesting trends. So in terms of the longer term policy, very notably, it doesn't make any difference if across the ages. So young people and old people, 26 to 27% think that United Ireland should be the long-term policy for Northern Ireland. However, when we're asking in relation to how would you vote, young people are much more clearly in favour of voting for Irish unification in such a referendum. So it's within the margin of error as to whether they would vote to stay in the UK or to unite with the rest of Ireland. So that's 38-40 amongst the younger, and then that difference is huge up to the over 65s, where you have a very clear majority saying that they vote to remain in the UK. Interestingly, there isn't a huge amount of difference amongst younger people and older people in with respect to the question of whether the UK will be existing in 20 years. And similarly, there is, I mean, there's, in terms of whether United Ireland would exist, even though we saw those younger people saying that they would vote for it, they still don't necessarily think it's likely. In fact, many more of them think that it's unlikely compared to likely. In fact, older people are more likely to think that there will be United Ireland in 20 years. And just one last thing in relation to the impact that Brexit has had on all of this. In terms of favouring it, the younger people are saying that Brexit makes them favour United Ireland much more than they would have done otherwise, makes them more in favour of Irish unity. When it comes to likelihood, those who are aged 35 to 44, 68% of those are saying that they think the United Ireland is made more likely by Brexit. Either side of those age groups, we don't see a huge difference. It's around 52 to 58%. So that's quite a notable finding. So you can see there, the picture is complicated. Some of the figures are reflected in the fact that younger people are more likely to say don't know on some of those questions. But I think that point about how they would vote in a border poll have been quite so different from that older generation, which is what we'd expect, to be honest with you. Those are quite interesting findings. So thank you, Jeff, for the question. Okay, very good. And Katy, do you have any sort of thoughts on Jamie or Duncan's comments there? Well, I was very grateful to Jamie for spelling out the what he thought those reform agendas might look like and what it might entail. And to answer your question, Jill, I mean, I don't think we could see, it wouldn't necessarily be a common point. So if we do run those questions in NILT next year or later this year, I would expect there to be quite a range of opinions as to what should be reformed. Because of course, when people are thinking about that reform, they're thinking in the main of their particular political priorities, or trying to avoid what they don't want to come about, or indeed minimize the risks, the political risks that they fear. So we would probably see very different answers depending on which particular perspective people come from. But I thought Jamie set them out very well. And I'd be interested to hear Duncan's comments in response to Jamie's suggestions. Duncan, do you want to come in on, is there actually a clear direction of reform of the institutions, or would that be a polarizing issue?
I hope the government works better. Actually, is that
what really strikes me as Jamie was talking and as Katy was talking is the institutional context within which Northern Ireland politics now happens is so uncertain that all of this language has to be almost parsed every time. So, for example, what is the United Kingdom after the protocol for Northern Irish Unionists? Is it the United Kingdom as is that they want? Is it an integral state? So there's a question about the nature of the United Kingdom, which is also being driven from Edinburgh as well as it is from Belfast. There's a second one, which is a United Ireland, which is in many ways a Brexit means Brexit question. It's a speculative idea without content being fully worked through. So there's a uncertainty about even when you ask the question, other than aspirationally, what that means. There's the agreement. When people say they're in favor of the agreement as is, what does that mean? Does that mean they're in favor of north-south bodies and power sharing? Does it mean they like the petition of concern? Does that mean they like human rights? Or is it a more generic sense of the safety of this body is, I don't want to lose it, but without much detail. So I think all I would say is in Northern Ireland politics at the moment, all of the concepts are very marshy at the moment. The other thing to say is, and the protocol, even as we speak, what is the protocol that we will have at the end of June? I personally couldn't tell you, but I assume that maybe in the G7 we will get some outcomes. But the truth is that even that is being event driven. So to answer your question directly, I think there are a number of issues which have given rise to really significant problems, one of which being the petition of concern, and that has divided people pro and contra, by the way. Of course, it's not a simple discussion, but and there are a number of things which are in the agreement which haven't actually been implemented or been set aside or have been reformed in different ways over the years. So, but the biggest problem is that the agreement itself, as I understand it, was originally driven by a top-down process of frameworks and understandings driven intergovernmentally. And that relationship at the moment is extremely uncertain. So the process of reform would, in my view, be extremely difficult to know what is the structure of reform before we even get to the question of what the reforms might be. And Jamie's suggestion that it might include bottom-up mechanisms and ways to include people might be a way out of that problem. But the bottom line we have at the moment is that the frameworks for reform seem to me to be more likely to be driven by a crisis in the current institutions rather than by some kind of platonic agreement that we need some change, if I'm honest.
I mean, that goes to a question, Duncan, we have, I have to say most of the questions aren't particularly on the Life and Times survey. They're about what's about to happen in Northern Ireland politics. So we're going to have to do a bit of what's about to happen in Northern Ireland politics. Fiona Rooney's just asked a question, which is whether we actually think the Assembly will be brought down imminently by DUP infighting or by Sinn Féin over a failure to implement the Irish Language Act. Do we think that the Assembly is on the point of collapse? Anyone want to come in that? Jamie, what do you reckon? Do you think the Assembly is on the point of collapse?
A low stakes question there, it seems. I mean,
you can take the fifth if you don't want to answer that.
I mean, it's a risk because as Fiona probably knows by asking the question, whenever Paul Givan now that he has been announced by the DUP as their nominee for First Minister, it is a joint office. So if Sinn Féin don't nominate Michelle O'Neill as Deputy First Minister alongside Paul Givan, then that would trigger a crisis. It would be high risk, I think, for both Sinn Féin and the DUP to face an early election. So I suspect that given the stakes, that the likelihood would be that that Sinn Féin don't raise the stakes too much. And do just kind of wait this out at least until the new executive team is in place and see if there is agreement then on getting the Irish language legislation and the other cultural legislation in place within the time frame. So it seems that those discussions have been happening behind the scenes to try and avert any kind of crisis whenever the announcement comes next week on the First and Deputy First Minister nominations.
Quite intrigued that you've been mentioning all along the NHS and the waiting lists, which we know are massively longer in Northern Ireland than any other part of the UK, as a potential problem. But what we saw in the elections that we've just had in the rest of the UK, of course, Northern Ireland didn't have elections in May, was a massive incumbency bounce to almost anyone who was in power who could claim a bit of credit for the vaccine rollout. Is there any sort of similar sort of halo effect on the Northern Ireland government from that? Because while the rest of the UK was re-electing incumbents, we saw the DUP unseating Arlene Foster and, general shenanigans around from, within Northern Irish politics. Is there an incumbency effect? And is Northern Ireland perceived to have done better than the Republic in terms of vaccine rollout? Will that have any impacts, do you expect? Katy.
Duncan unmuted himself, which I take as a sign of readiness.
Duncan.
Well, my first of all, incumbency in Northern Ireland, it takes a mandate from 2017. And the 2017 mandate is, in a sense, so outdated because so much has happened in between, including the DUP holding the balance of power at Westminster, no government. And the elections, we had 3 elections in Northern Ireland in 2019, which kind of radically changed the picture, at least in 2019, in the European elections, local elections, and in Westminster elections. So there was no incumbency bounce, if that was what it was meant to be, because they hadn't hardly done anything at that point. In fact, they had not really been in at all. There was, in fact, a backlash that was evident, and it went mostly to the Alliance Party and in seat bonus in the 2019 general election to the SDLP. So there's that aspect, that this mandate is older and hasn't adjusted to a certain period. The second element is, there is, I think, some evidence that the health minister is particularly popular because of the way that he has conducted himself. But whether that would turn into votes for a political party, or whether that's to do with that he has done the incumbency equivalent of creating safety for the general population, that's a second element. But there is some evidence that Robin Swan is personally popular for his work in the pandemic. And he's an Ulster Union. He's an Ulster Unionist. He's an Ulster Unionist, not a Democratic Unionist. But there's no real evidence that has passed on to his party, which are still measured by. But we wait and see. And then the third element is that the infighting in the Northern Ireland Executive around some of the pandemic issues, particularly in the autumn, was seen as very detrimental to the Executive's authority in the pandemic. In fact, it was, I think, at a general public level, a sense of despair about the inability to come to decisions. So that issue is important. And maybe just one final point about the NHS. The point about the NHS, I think, is that the NHS isn't just a waiting list problem, it's a failure of governance problem. In other words, it is very widely regarded as an issue which executive constructed on our basis, where all parties are in together, has not been able somehow to resolve. The parties have not been willing to trade the difficult local issues which a health reform would require. So the NHS is an extremely nested and complex issue now in Northern Ireland. I think after the pandemic will really rise in salience.
So a question here from Nicholas Stone, which is, we've been talking about where we are. Duncan was just mentioning how old the mandate is. So we may have imminent assembly elections if the executive collapses. We're due to have assembly elections anyway next year. And then 2 years later, we have, in 2024, we have the first consent vote, I think, on the protocol, whatever the protocol is by then, which hopefully we will know. where is the focus of political parties? Nicola Stone is asking what preparations they're making for the 2024 protocol vote, but are they really focusing on that? Or are they more focusing on assembly elections as a sort of proxy for that? Katy.
Yes. Do you want me to complicate things by mentioning another survey?
You're allowed to complicate things as much as you like, Katy.
Not a sign of but essentially, so my colleague David Finnemore and I conducted a poll with Lucid Talk, which is a totally different type of poll. It's used as an opinion panel, but on the protocol. And one of the questions we were asking was about whether that question of the protocol and the consent vote at the end of 2024, which is on Articles 5 to 10 of the protocol, i.e. the Irish Sea border, whether that will affect people's choice of candidate in the next Assembly election. And very interestingly, the vast majority of people were saying yes, it would, and they would only vote for people who supported their view of the protocol. And it was pretty much evenly split between those who say, with 42% saying they'll only vote for a candidate who supports the full implementation of the protocol, and 39% saying they'll only vote for a candidate who will either scrap the protocol or vote down Articles 5 to 10. So that's quite telling, I think, when we think of how that protocol, which so many people at the end of last year, we see from NILT, were saying they weren't really sure about its detail or how quickly now it's become such a politically salient matter. Of course, that survey was conducted that poll was conducted at the end of March. So, you know, even before the sort of riots that we saw in April. But it was quite clear at that time, and since that the DUP in particular were focusing on that consent vote as a means of trying to garner support and coalescence around the unionist cause, as defending the UK against the, Northern Ireland's position in the UK against the protocol and what it might mean. That seemed to be getting up a lot of speed. So it sort of made sense, if you like, heading into the next Assembly election, we want a clear anti-protocol majority, therefore vote for the DUP because as a major unionist party. That seems to have fallen apart as a result of what the DUP has almost done for itself. And then another Lucid Talk poll. I'm being very balanced here. Another Lucid Talk poll was regularly conducted for the Belfast Telegraph is showing just how support for the DUP dramatically dropped. In fact, it's the same now at 16% as the Alliance Party, Sinn Féin up to 25%, I think it was. And we don't know what's going to happen. I mean, if you look within the DUP, what's happening now, you couldn't imagine that support as even being 16% now. So it will be wanting to avoid an election for as long as possible, I imagine. So in the space of a few weeks, as a result of the protocol, and then as a result of internal party politics and responses to the perceived crisis, how dramatically things have changed and fortunes have changed. And just to mention, yes, the Ulster Unionist Party, which was emphasising quite a lot the very the good pollings for Robin Swan as a health minister, and they were emphasising him. He was basically their best hope of support. They don't need to do that now. They're going in a slightly different direction. So it is very much in change, and how the degree to which the protocol is the issue will remain one that people will see as being critical when it comes to casting their vote or their votes. We'll find out in the next Lucid Talk poll. Should I do another plug for another survey?
do some more, as many plugs as you want, Katy.
Okay.
But very relevant to that, those very low figures for the DUP now, is a question from Philip Scott, who's asking if Sinn Féin's the largest party after the next Assembly election, would the DUP, assuming they're the largest unionist party, ever accept a Sinn Féin First Minister? I mean, you're talking about effectively they're the same job. I mean, it's one job divided by two people, isn't it? And joint first ministers, even if it's First Minister and Deputy First Minister. But would that be presentationally unacceptable to the Democratic Unionists? Who wants to pick that one up? Jamie. Bad luck.
Yeah, well, I mean, psychologically, it would certainly be a big deal. We've said that, it's essentially a joint office. The titles are symbolic rather than substantive. But psychologically, within unionism, it would be a big deal for a unionist not to hold the first minister position, and especially now that this is, I think, adding to the psychological trauma within unionism in some ways in this centenary year. Whenever there's maybe just such a degree of reflection on how things have changed. So it could certainly, precipitate a crisis, in the event then that, say, the DUP were the second largest party, they were still the largest unionist party and able to nominate a deputy first minister. But obviously, if they didn't nominate someone, then that would be the kind of political crisis that, we were probably just alluding to earlier, which would probably take things in a new direction in terms of cross-party negotiations to try and work out what comes next. But it wouldn't be obvious what would come next, because presumably it's going to be some form of devolution. But getting people back around the table in that kind of context would be very difficult, because then if you're Sinn Féin, who has earned the position of First Minister, then the question would be, why would they want to concede that position all of a sudden, whenever it hasn't been an issue on the agenda for the last 23 years. So it's definitely something that's coming down the tracks. But the noises that have been made so far by Edwin Poots have suggested that it's not been made an issue so far as I have heard from any of his interviews. It's maybe more questions to him from journalists have raised this more than him raising this prospect himself. So hopefully it doesn't end up in a crisis, but it is one of those things that it could be difficult to predict how it would unfold at the time.
Couple of questions here, which I'm going to put to Duncan first. Put you on notice, Duncan, about the quality of politicians, the dearth of political talent. I'm not sure. Derek White, given the dearth of political talent maturity both within Northern Ireland and GB at present, so we're not exempted. What scope is there for positive movement driven by public and the third sector? And Barry Fisher asking, is the quality of our politicians more of an issue than reform of institutions? I don't know, do you think there's a political talent deficit in Northern Ireland? Are we getting the politicians we deserve, or quite? What is the problem?
Up until now, the talent has been defined by the ability to keep your group together, rather than by the ability to make compromises and accommodations in a society which have the figures that we've just seen are part of the job. So the question isn't about general competence, it's about the challenge that's in front of people, both to represent their people and then make the deals. So I suppose you could argue that in 1998 and people have made hard decisions and they've made difficult choices, but the NHS issue shows you that there are limits on that, and the protocol issue is really straining everything to the last minute. And whether it's entirely to do with individual politicians or whether we can find some, but I certainly think within the Northern Ireland Assembly it's not the case that it's entirely made up of people who don't have ability and capacity. So I would want to defend them a little bit on that. The second thing is, however, I think that the conversation that we've had up to now really does show the precariousness that Northern Ireland now is living with. We live with precariousness over Brexit because Brexit asks a border question, which really is not the question we want to ask. The protocol is in place, and it has created another degree of extreme uncertainty in Northern Ireland. The political system is straining at the bit to manage all of this. And the question that you put to Jamie just there about Sinn Féin taking the leadership shows you just how complex this is. Symbolically, it's hard to imagine a bigger problem for unionism than Sinn Féin leading Northern Ireland. That is, and especially if what might happen in the south happens, which is the Taoiseach might be a Sinn Féin party member at some time in the future. So you might have Sinn Féin in these leading roles. Now we know that First Minister is a bit of a misnomer in the sense that it is a joint office and it's equal, but the symbolics of this are pretty dramatic. So that will take leadership to somebody to get through that, because to be honest, at some point that may well happen and it needs to be factored in as a possibility. And as we've talked about, the splintering of unionism at this particular moment into multiple different groups is politically not good at an election, obviously. And even with STV, single transferable vote, you can't be sure that it'll all come back to a single party. So it may not be a short-term question, that may be a long-term question. That has to be resolved. And then on the other side of that is they do have to have a vote in the next assembly period on the protocol. And that vote will be defining effectively probably for Northern Ireland's future, because a watershed was passed in 2017 which almost went unnoticed. And that was that unionist MLAs do not command a majority of numbers on the floor of the assembly. And so that was for the first time, in fact, in any parliamentary election in Northern Ireland. And if that is remained, then Northern Ireland has to work more and more towards the accommodation issue to go back, and our ability to bring politicians forward who do that is going to be critical. And the electorate are showing some signs at the moment of saying that they do want at least politicians who keep devolution up. In 2019, there was a big backlash against politicians who were seen to have not worked the assembly. Whether that was a pro-alliance or a pro-union vote, I wouldn't want to speculate, but it certainly seemed to me to represent a view quite widely held in the community that in governance terms, that there needs to be an improvement in the willingness to take decisions and to govern rather than to walk away.
I just want to ask you one question very quickly, Jeff, then I'm going to ask Katy a question on the protocol to end. Katy, you're under advisement there. It's another question from Jeff Horn, who's suggesting that the combination in unionism of increased fatalism about a united Ireland with strong opposition to it, does that make extremism more or less likely? Duncan, do you have a view on that? Duncan, you're muted.
Right. Yeah, I suppose a vacuum, the question of a political vacuum, and the fact that actually, even beyond the splintering of the unionist parties, is this deep sense in some of the loyalist communities and the working class communities of alienation from politics as a whole. So, of course, I think if we're honest, the ghost of the feast here is what is the size of that? What is the nature of that? What is the limits of that as we go into this summer? Because the political atmosphere is certainly tense and uncertain. But there, as Jamie said in one of his comments, and I think it's right, you can overestimate the support for that extremism, but you have a political situation which has allowed lots of groups to be acting without any clear political direction. And that is a risky scenario, I think. And so it's more about, it's one of those things where you don't want to say it is because you don't want to give permission for it. On the other side, as people analysing the situation, you have to say there are certainly evidence that those things are there.
Katy, G7 meeting in Cornwall, an unlikely place to be headlining sausages, trade in Northern Ireland and stuff like that, where there's some other big global issues to be sorted. But a question from Michael Wales: can President Biden save the Northern Ireland protocol? Final question. You have 1 minute.
Well, certainly he's been very outspoken on the matter, and Jake Sullivan's contribution as well is saying that the US is keeping a very close eye on what the UK does. And I think all the soft power that Ireland has in the US and how well it's used that soft power is now bearing fruit at this critical moment. It did before in 2019, stressing the need to avoid a hard border on the island of Ireland and support the Good Friday agreement. And now too, it's about upholding an international agreement. And I think it's very clear that Biden will make that point over and over again, that it's unwavering the US interest in Northern Ireland and the concern for the peace process here. They call themselves a co-guarantor of the Good Friday Agreement, and that's how seriously they take their role. And I think that the special relationship won't have will actually prove less significant than the US's support for peace here. So yeah, I'd be hopeful that if anybody can make a difference, President Biden's contribution alongside that of Merkel and Macron may well push things forward in the direction we all hope to see.
Well, hopefully the US administration is sitting in their reservation. I think they're all stuck in Cornwall watching this, so they will know that Katy has put the onus on them to make sure we end the weekend in a better place than we are starting it on the Northern Ireland Protocol. I'm just going to end everything there. Thank you all very much for listening. Thank you very much for your excellent questions. Sorry if we didn't get to all of them, but very particular thanks to ARC, to Paula, Katy, Duncan and Jamie for a very excellent discussion. Do read all that detail that we just skated over in the survey, which is always a source of huge amounts of interest on what's going on in Northern Ireland. Do look out for next year's. It's going to be, I think, even more interesting, given all the subjects that we were discussing and the recurrent theme of precariousness over there. And do tell your friends about this, and they can watch back on YouTube. So thank you all very much for joining us, and we will end it there.